Sometimes the most desperate cries for help come in the quietest whispers. In a crowded classroom filled with the rustling of test papers and nervous pencil tapping, one brave soul decided to risk everything with just 3 simple words scrawled in the margin of a math exam. She had no idea that those words would set in motion a chain of events that would not only save her life, but transform the lives of everyone around her. This is the story of how a teacher's keen eye and compassionate heart turned a moment of desperation into a beacon of hope. It's about the power of paying attention, the courage to speak up, and the incredible impact one person can have when they choose to act rather than look away. What happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles. Keisha Washington sat in the 3rd row of Mrs. Rodriguez's 7th grade math class, her thin frame hunched over a desk that seemed too big for her small body. At 12 years old, she had learned to make herself invisible, a skill that had become essential for survival in her daily life. Her dark eyes, once bright with childhood wonder, now carried shadows that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 28 students worked quietly on their algebra test. Mrs. Rodriguez walked between the rows, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the worn linoleum floor. She had been teaching for 15 years, and something about Keisha had caught her attention from the first day of school 3 months ago. While other students chatted excitedly before class or shared stories about their weekends, Keisha always arrived early and sat silently, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She never raised her hand to answer questions, even when Mrs. Rodriguez could see recognition flickering in her eyes. During lunch, when most kids rushed to the cafeteria, Keisha would linger in the classroom, pretending to organize her papers or asking quiet questions about homework. Mrs. Rodriguez had tried several times to engage Keisha in conversation. She had complimented her neat handwriting, praised her careful attention to detail on assignments, and even asked about her interests outside school. Each time, Keisha would offer a shy smile and a brief response before retreating back into her shell. There was something guarded about the way she carried herself, as if she was constantly braced for disappointment or worse. The test that Tuesday morning was on solving linear equations, a topic that had challenged many students in the class. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that Keisha was working steadily through the problems, her pencil moving with careful precision across the page. She had always been a solid student, not the brightest in the class, but certainly capable and hardworking. What Mrs. Rodriguez didn't know was the battle that raged inside Keisha's mind as she worked through each math problem. At home the night before, she had tried to study at the kitchen table while her mother's boyfriend, Marcus, watched television in the living room. The volume was turned up loud, drowning out her thoughts and making concentration nearly impossible. Marcus had been living with them for 8 months now, and life had become increasingly difficult since his arrival. Keisha's mother, Linda, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning office buildings at night and stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day. She was rarely home, leaving Keisha alone with Marcus more often than either of them was comfortable with. At first, Marcus had seemed nice enough. He brought flowers for her mother and even helped Keisha with her homework a few times. But as the months passed, his behavior began to change. He started making comments about how Keisha was growing up, how she was becoming a beautiful young woman. His eyes would linger on her longer than felt comfortable, and he began finding excuses to be near her when her mother wasn't around. The comments escalated to inappropriate touches, a hand on her shoulder that stayed too long, hugs that felt wrong, brushing against her in the hallway when there was plenty of room to pass. Keisha tried to tell her mother, but Linda was exhausted from working double shifts and struggling to keep their small apartment. When Keisha mentioned that Marcus made her uncomfortable, her mother dismissed it as typical teenage drama. "Marcus is good to us," Linda had said, not looking up from the bills scattered across the coffee table. "He helps with rent, and he's trying to be nice to you. Don't be so dramatic, Keisha. We need him right now." But things had gotten worse in recent weeks. Marcus had started coming into her room at night, claiming he was checking on her or bringing her water. He would sit on the edge of her bed and try to start conversations that made her skin crawl. Last week, he had touched her in a way that made her feel sick and confused and terrified all at once. Keisha felt trapped and alone. She couldn't tell her mother, who either wouldn't believe her or couldn't afford to lose Marcus's financial support. She had no other family nearby. Her grandmother lived 3 states away, and her father had disappeared when she was 6 years old. Her few friends at school lived their own complicated lives and probably wouldn't understand or know how to help. As she worked through the algebra problems, Keisha's mind wandered to the growing fear that consumed her thoughts. Marcus had been hinting lately about spending more time alone with her, especially on weekends when her mother worked longer shifts. The thought made her stomach turn and her hands shake slightly as she gripped her pencil. She tried to focus on the numbers and variables in front of her, but the fear kept creeping back in. What would happen if she told someone at school? Would they believe her? Would they call her mother? Would Marcus find out and make things worse? The questions swirled in her head as she mechanically worked through equation after equation. Mrs. Rodriguez continued her quiet patrol of the classroom, occasionally stopping to answer whispered questions or remind students to show their work. She noticed that Keisha seemed more distracted than usual, her normally steady pace interrupted by long pauses where she would stare at the paper without writing anything. The classroom was warm despite the November chill outside, and the bell rang sharply at 10:45 a.m., signaling the end of the testing period. Students began gathering their belongings with the familiar sounds of zippers closing, chairs scraping against the floor, and quiet conversations starting up again. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the front of the classroom with her hands extended, ready to collect the completed tests. "Please pass your papers forward," she announced, watching as the stack of tests made their way from the back rows to the front. Keisha carefully placed her test in the pile, her heart still racing from the bold step she had taken. She avoided eye contact with Mrs. Rodriguez as she gathered her notebook and pencil case, slipping them into her worn backpack. As students filed out for their next class, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that Keisha was moving more slowly than usual. The girl seemed lost in thought, almost reluctant to leave the classroom. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Mrs. Rodriguez saw something in Keisha's expression that made her pause. There was a vulnerability there, a silent question that seemed to hang in the air between them. "Have a good rest of your day, Keisha," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently, hoping to encourage some kind of response. Keisha managed a small smile and nodded before disappearing into the crowded hallway. Mrs. Rodriguez watched her go, that nagging feeling of concern growing stronger. Something was definitely troubling this child, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes, lesson plans, and the usual controlled chaos of middle school education. Mrs. Rodriguez taught 3 more periods before her lunch break, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Keisha. During her planning period, she decided to start grading the morning's tests while eating her sandwich at her desk. She had developed a system over the years for grading efficiently while still providing meaningful feedback to her students. She would work through each test methodically, marking correct answers with small check marks and circling problems that needed more work. For questions answered incorrectly, she would write brief notes in the margins to help students understand their mistakes. Mrs. Rodriguez was about halfway through the stack when she reached Keisha's test. As expected, the work was neat and organized, with each step of the problem-solving process clearly shown. Keisha had gotten most of the answers correct, demonstrating a solid understanding of the material they had been studying. But as Mrs. Rodriguez worked her way down the page, checking each answer and making notes, something caught her eye that made her stop completely. There, in the margin next to problem 15, written in Keisha's careful handwriting, were 2 words that hit her like a physical blow: "Help me." Mrs. Rodriguez stared at the words for a long moment, her pen frozen in her hand. In 15 years of teaching, she had seen many different ways that students communicated distress. Some acted out in class, others withdrew completely, and some found creative ways to express their feelings through their schoolwork. But she had never encountered such a direct, simple plea for help written on a math test. The words were small but clear, written in the same blue ink that Keisha had used for the rest of the test. They weren't doodled absent-mindedly or written in frustration with a difficult problem. They seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if Keisha had made a conscious decision to reach out in the only way she could think of. Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart rate quicken as she considered the implications. She thought back to all the small signs she had noticed over the past few months. Keisha's withdrawal, her constant tiredness, the way she seemed to flinch sometimes when people moved too quickly near her, her reluctance to go home after school. Setting the test aside, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began making notes about everything she had observed about Keisha's behavior. The always covered arms, the hunger at lunchtime, the way she arrived early and stayed late, the sadness in her eyes that seemed far too deep for a 12-year-old. As she wrote, Mrs. Rodriguez felt a growing sense of urgency. She had taken enough training courses and workshops to recognize potential signs of abuse or neglect, but she had never been faced with such a direct request for help from a student. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. This child was trusting her with something critically important, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She looked at the clock on her classroom wall and realized that Keisha would be in her 6th period science class right now. Mrs. Rodriguez made a quick decision to walk down to the science wing, ostensibly to speak with a colleague, but really to see if she could observe Keisha's behavior in a different setting. Through the small window in the science classroom door, Mrs. Rodriguez could see Keisha sitting in the middle row, hunched over her notebook as the teacher demonstrated an experiment at the front of the room. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in the girl's shoulders and the way she seemed to be holding herself apart from the other students around her. Mrs. Rodriguez returned to her classroom with her mind racing. She knew she needed to act, but she also knew she had to be careful. If Keisha was indeed in danger at home, a clumsy intervention could potentially make things worse for her. She needed to follow proper protocols while also making sure that Keisha felt supported and safe. The first step was to document everything carefully. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out her laptop and began typing up a detailed report of her observations over the past few months. She noted specific dates when she had observed concerning behaviors, described Keisha's general demeanor and academic performance, and carefully documented the discovery of the plea for help on the test. As she wrote, she realized just how many small warning signs she had noticed without fully connecting them. Keisha's reluctance to participate in physical education classes, often claiming to feel sick on days when they had gym. Her tendency to wear long sleeves, even on warm days. The way she would sometimes startle when touched unexpectedly. Her apparent lack of close friendships with other students. Mrs. Rodriguez also made note of positive observations, Keisha's intelligence and capability when it came to academics, her respectful behavior in class, her evident desire to please and do well in school. These weren't the behaviors of a troubled child acting out, but rather those of a child trying desperately to maintain normalcy while dealing with something terrible in her personal life. The final period of the day dragged on as Mrs. Rodriguez watched the clock, her carefully planned words running through her mind like a rehearsed script. She had decided to keep the conversation light and non-threatening at first, giving Keisha every opportunity to share what she felt comfortable sharing without pressure or judgment. When the dismissal bell finally rang, Mrs. Rodriguez watched as students packed their belongings with the excited energy that always accompanied the end of the school day. Conversations about after-school plans and weekend activities filled the air as backpacks were zipped and chairs pushed under desks. Keisha moved with her usual quiet efficiency, sliding her notebook into her backpack and preparing to leave with the rest of the class. Mrs. Rodriguez waited until most of the other students had filed out before approaching her desk. "Keisha, could you stay for just a few minutes?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked gently. "I wanted to talk to you about your test from this morning." Keisha's expression immediately became guarded, her dark eyes searching Mrs. Rodriguez's face for clues about what kind of trouble she might be in. She nodded silently and returned to her seat, clutching her backpack in her lap like a shield. Mrs. Rodriguez waited until the last student had left and the hallway noise had died down before closing her classroom door. She didn't want their conversation to be interrupted or overheard by passing students or staff members. Then, she pulled a chair over to sit beside Keisha rather than standing over her, trying to create a sense of equality and safety in their interaction. "First of all, I want you to know that you did very well on your test," Mrs. Rodriguez began, pulling out Keisha's paper. Your work is always so neat and thorough, and you clearly understand the concepts we've been studying. Keisha managed a small smile but remained silent, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. But I noticed something else on your test that concerned me, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her voice remaining gentle and non-accusatory. She turned the paper so that Keisha could see the margin where she had written, "Help me," though she was careful not to point directly at the words. Keisha's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she looked as though she wanted to disappear into her chair. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, clearly struggling with what to say or whether to say anything at all. "Keisha, I want you to know that you're not in any kind of trouble," Mrs. Rodriguez said quickly, recognizing the fear in the girl's expression. "But when a student writes something like this, it tells me that they might need some kind of help or support. And if that's the case, I want you to know that you have people here who care about you and want to make sure you're safe and okay." The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Mrs. Rodriguez could see the internal battle playing out on Keisha's face, the desire to finally tell someone what was happening warring with fear, shame, and uncertainty about whether she would be believed or helped. "I don't know what to do," Keisha finally whispered, her voice so quiet that Mrs. Rodriguez had to lean forward to hear her. "I don't know who to tell or if anyone would even believe me." Mrs. Rodriguez felt her heart break a little at the pain and confusion in the child's voice. "You can tell me," she said gently. "Whatever it is, I will believe you, and we can figure out together what needs to be done to help you." Keisha looked up at her teacher for the first time since their conversation began, and Mrs. Rodriguez could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. "It's my mom's boyfriend," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she was afraid she would lose her courage if she didn't speak quickly. "He does things to me when she's not home. Bad things. And when I tried to tell my mom, she didn't believe me. She said I was being dramatic and that we need him because he helps pay the bills." Mrs. Rodriguez felt a surge of anger on behalf of this brave little girl, but she kept her expression calm and supportive. "Can you tell me what kinds of things he does?" she asked gently, knowing that she needed to gather enough information to ensure Keisha's immediate safety. Over the next 20 minutes, Keisha slowly shared the details of what had been happening at home. She described Marcus's escalating behavior, from inappropriate comments and looks to unwanted touching and worse. She talked about her fear of being alone with him, especially on weekends when her mother worked long shifts. Mrs. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, occasionally asking gentle questions for clarification, but mostly just letting Keisha know through her attention and concern that she was being heard and believed. She made mental notes of everything Keisha shared, knowing that these details would be crucial for the authorities who would become involved. "How long has this been going on?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked when Keisha had finished sharing what she felt comfortable sharing. "It started getting really bad about a month ago," Keisha said, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. "But he's been making me uncomfortable since he moved in with us back in the spring." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, pieces of the puzzle falling into place as she thought back to the changes she had noticed in Keisha's behavior over the past several months. "Keisha, I am so proud of you for being brave enough to write those words on your test, and for sharing this with me now. That took enormous courage, and I want you to know that you did exactly the right thing." Keisha looked surprised at the praise, as if she had expected to be blamed or judged for her situation. "What happens now?" she asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Are you going to call my mom? Because if Marcus finds out I told someone, we're going to make sure you're safe," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "That's the most important thing right now. I'm going to need to involve some other people, our school counselor, and probably some people from Child Protective Services, but their job is to help children who are in unsafe situations. Nothing bad is going to happen to you because you told the truth about what's been happening." Mrs. Rodriguez explained the process that would likely unfold over the next few hours and days, being careful to prepare Keisha for what to expect, while also reassuring her that trained professionals would handle the situation from here on out. She emphasized that Keisha had done nothing wrong and that the adults in her life had failed to protect her as they should have. "Can I stay here with you until someone comes?" Keisha asked, clearly afraid of the prospect of going home before other arrangements could be made. Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez said without hesitation. You can stay here as long as you need to. Let me make some phone calls, and we'll figure out the best way to keep you safe. As Mrs. Rodriguez reached for her phone to call the school's guidance counselor, she felt a mixture of heartbreak and hope. Heartbreak for what this sweet, intelligent child had endured, but hope that her courage in reaching out would finally put an end to her suffering. Keisha sat quietly in her chair, still clutching her backpack, but looking slightly more relaxed than she had when their conversation began. For the first time in months, she had shared her secret with a trusted adult who believed her and was taking action to help her. The road ahead would be difficult, with interviews and investigations and probably a lot of changes in her living situation, but she was no longer facing her nightmare alone. Mrs. Rodriguez's first call was to the school counselor, who immediately came to the classroom to speak with Keisha and help coordinate the next steps. From there, they would contact Child Protective Services and law enforcement as required by school policy and state law. Within 30 minutes of Mrs. Rodriguez's phone call, the school counselor, Ms. Jennifer Adams, arrived at the classroom with a gentle knock on the door. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put nervous students at ease. Over her 10 years at the school, she had handled many difficult situations involving children in crisis, but each case still affected her deeply. "Hi, Keisha," Ms. Adams said softly, settling into a chair that Mrs. Rodriguez had arranged in their small circle. "Mrs. Rodriguez told me that you've been going through some difficult things at home, and I want you to know that we're here to help you through this." Keisha looked between the two women, still processing the reality that her secret was finally out in the open. Part of her felt relieved, but another part was terrified about what would happen next. "Are you going to take me away from my mom?" she asked, her voice small and worried. Ms. Adams chose her words carefully, knowing that Keisha needed honesty balanced with reassurance. "Right now, our main concern is making sure you're safe. There are people whose job it is to investigate situations like yours and figure out the best way to protect children. They'll want to talk to you and your mother and make decisions based on what they learn." While Ms. Adams spoke with Keisha, Mrs. Rodriguez stepped aside to make additional phone calls. The first was to the principal, Dr. Martinez, who needed to be informed about the situation immediately. The second was to the county's Child Protective Services hotline, where she was connected to an intake worker who would begin the formal process of investigating Keisha's allegations. The intake worker, Sarah Thompson, had been handling child abuse cases for 8 years. She asked Mrs. Rodriguez detailed questions about what Keisha had disclosed, when the conversation had taken place, and what evidence existed of the abuse. Mrs. Rodriguez carefully read from the notes she had taken during her conversation with Keisha, making sure not to leave out any important details. "We'll need to send someone out immediately," Sarah said after hearing the full account. "Given what the child has disclosed and the fact that the alleged perpetrator lives in the home, we can't allow her to return there tonight. We'll also need to coordinate with local police since this appears to involve criminal activity." Within an hour, Detective Lisa Chun from the County Sheriff's Department arrived at the school. She was part of a specialized unit that handled crimes against children and had extensive training in interviewing young victims in ways that were both thorough and sensitive to their emotional needs. Detective Chun was a petite woman with a calm demeanor and years of experience helping children through traumatic situations. She knew that how she handled this first official interview could significantly impact both the investigation and Keisha's long-term healing process. "Hi, Keisha," Detective Chun said, introducing herself and explaining her role in gentle terms that a 12-year-old could understand. "I know this is scary, but you've been really brave to tell Mrs. Rodriguez what's been happening. Now my job is to make sure you stay safe and to find out more about what's been going on at home." The interview took place in a private conference room at the school, with Ms. Adams present to provide emotional support for Keisha. Detective Chun used specialized techniques designed for child interviews, allowing Keisha to tell her story in her own words while asking clarifying questions that would help build a strong case if criminal charges were filed. Keisha recounted the escalating pattern of abuse, providing specific details about incidents that had occurred over the past several months. Detective Chen noted that the girl's account was consistent and detailed, with the kind of specific information that would be difficult for a child to fabricate. Has anyone else ever touched you in ways that made you uncomfortable? Detective Chun asked gently, following standard protocols to ensure they had a complete picture of Keisha's situation. No, just Marcus, Keisha replied firmly. And he said that if I told anyone, nobody would believe me because I'm just a kid and he's an adult. He said my mom needs him and would be angry at me if I caused trouble. Detective Chen felt familiar anger at hearing about the manipulative tactics that abusers often use to keep their victims silent. The threats, the isolation, the systematic erosion of a child's confidence in the adults who should protect them. It was a pattern she had seen too many times before. Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson from Child Protective Services had arrived and was coordinating with school officials and law enforcement to develop an immediate safety plan for Keisha. Given the allegations and the fact that Marcus lived in the family home, they could not allow Keisha to return there until a full investigation was completed. Do you have any relatives you could stay with temporarily? Sarah asked Keisha during a break in the interviews. Maybe a grandmother or aunt or uncle who lives nearby? Keisha shook her head sadly. My grandmother lives in Florida, and I don't really know any of my other relatives. My mom doesn't talk to her family much. This meant that Keisha would likely need to be placed in emergency foster care while the investigation proceeded. Sarah began making calls to find an appropriate placement, preferably with a family that had experience caring for children who had experienced trauma. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Martinez coordinated with the district's legal team to ensure that the school was following all required protocols while also protecting Keisha's privacy and well-being. Word of the investigation had not spread beyond the small group of professionals who needed to know, and they were committed to keeping the situation as confidential as possible. Around 4 p.m., Detective Chin felt she had gathered enough information for the immediate investigation. Keisha, you've been incredibly helpful and brave, she told the girl. Based on what you've told me, we're going to arrest Marcus and make sure he can't hurt you anymore. Keisha's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and fear. What about my mom? Is she going to be in trouble too? Your mom will need to be interviewed as part of the investigation, Detective Chin explained. Right now, we don't know how much she knew about what was happening or why she didn't believe you when you tried to tell her. Those are questions we'll need to ask her. The plan that emerged was complex, but designed to prioritize Keisha's safety above all else. Detective Chun would coordinate with other officers to arrest Marcus that evening, timing it for when Linda returned from work so that she would be present and could be interviewed immediately about her knowledge of the situation. Sarah Thompson had located an emergency foster family, the Johnsons, who were experienced in caring for children in crisis situations. They had been briefed on Keisha's situation and were prepared to provide a safe, stable environment while longer-term arrangements were developed. The Johnsons have 2 daughters of their own, both teenagers, Sarah explained to Keisha. They're used to helping kids who are going through difficult situations, and they'll make sure you have everything you need while we sort all this out. Mrs. Rodriguez had stayed at the school well past her usual departure time, unwilling to leave until she knew that Keisha was safe and had a plan in place. As the various professionals coordinated their next steps, she sat with Keisha in her classroom, helping her organize her school materials and talking through what the next few days might look like. Will I be able to come back to school tomorrow? Keisha asked, clearly worried about falling behind in her classes. The Johnsons live in our school district, so yes, you should be able to continue coming here, Mrs. Rodriguez assured her. And if you need extra help or support with your schoolwork while you're dealing with all of this, we'll make sure you get it. As evening approached, it was time for Keisha to leave with Sarah Thompson to meet her temporary foster family. The girl had been at school for nearly 10 hours, but she seemed reluctant to leave the safety and familiarity of Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom. I don't know what's going to happen, Keisha said quietly as she shouldered her backpack. Mrs. Rodriguez knelt down to Keisha's eye level, placing gentle hands on the girl's shoulders. I know it's scary not knowing what comes next, but I want you to remember something important. You were strong enough to ask for help when you needed it, and that strength is going to carry you through whatever comes next. And you're not alone anymore. There are people who care about you and who are working too as they waited for the counselor to arrive. Mrs. Rodriguez sat quietly with Keisha, offering her a snack from her desk drawer and helping her with some homework to keep her mind occupied. The simple normalcy of working on math problems together provided a sense of stability and routine in what was sure to be a very difficult and emotional evening. Mrs. Rodriguez? Keisha said suddenly, looking up from her worksheet. Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for noticing. Thank you for caring enough to ask. Mrs. Rodriguez felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she looked at this brave young girl who had been carrying such a heavy burden alone for so long. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help, she replied. That's what saved you, Keisha. Your own courage is what made all the difference. The more she wrote, the more convinced Mrs. Rodriguez became that Keisha was in serious trouble and needed immediate help. But she also knew that her next steps needed to be carefully considered. She couldn't simply call the child's mother without knowing more about the home situation. If the abuse was coming from within the family, that phone call could put Keisha in even greater danger. Mrs. Rodriguez knew she needed to involve the school's guidance counselor and possibly the administration, but she also wanted to speak with Keisha first if possible. The girl had reached out to her specifically, trusting her with this crucial information. She felt a responsibility to handle that trust with care and wisdom. Looking at the test paper again, Mrs. Rodriguez felt a renewed sense of determination. Those two simple words represented an enormous act of courage from a child who probably felt powerless and alone. Keisha had found a way to ask for help despite what were likely significant barriers and fears. Now it was up to the adults in her life to respond appropriately and effectively. The final bell of the day would ring in just over an hour, and Mrs. Rodriguez made a decision. She would ask Keisha to stay after class for a few minutes, ostensibly to discuss her test performance, but really to give the girl an opportunity to share more about her situation if she felt comfortable doing so. She carefully placed Keisha's test in a folder along with her written observations, knowing that these documents might become crucial evidence in whatever investigation or intervention would follow. Then, she began planning exactly what she would say to Keisha when the opportunity presented itself. Mrs. Rodriguez had never felt the weight of her responsibility as an educator more heavily than she did in that moment. A child's safety and possibly her life might depend on the decisions made in the next few hours. But she also felt a sense of hope. Keisha had been brave enough to ask for help, and now the adults in her life had a chance to respond with the protection and support she so desperately needed. Indeed, most students had shed their jackets and sweaters, but Keisha kept her long-sleeved shirt pulled down to her wrists and her cardigan wrapped tightly around her small frame. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed this pattern for weeks now. Keisha always seemed to be covering up, even on warmer days when other students were comfortable in short sleeves. There were other small signs that Mrs. Rodriguez had begun to piece together, though she hadn't yet formed a complete picture. Keisha often seemed tired, as if she hadn't slept well. She was usually hungry and would eat her school lunch quickly, as though she wasn't sure when her next meal might come. Sometimes there were faint bruises on her arms that she would cover quickly if anyone noticed. As the test period continued, Keisha found herself struggling more with her emotions than with the math problems. The familiar feeling of helplessness was threatening to overwhelm her, and she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, not wanting to draw attention to herself in the middle of the test. But, in that moment of desperation, sitting in the safety of Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom, surrounded by the normal sounds of students taking a test, Keisha made a decision that would change everything. Her hand moved almost without conscious thought, and, in the margin of her test paper, next to problem number 15, she wrote two small words that carried the weight of her entire world. Help me. She stared at the words for a long moment, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to erase them immediately, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But another part of her, the part that was tired of being afraid and tired of feeling alone, left them there. Mrs. Rodriguez continued her walk around the classroom, unaware that one of her students had just reached out in the only way she knew how. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the end of the testing period, and soon students would be turning in their papers and moving on to their next class. But, for Keisha, this test would mark a turning point. She didn't know it yet, but Those two small words written in a moment of courage would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately save her from a situation that was growing more dangerous with each passing day. As she finished the last few problems on the test, Keisha felt a mixture of fear and relief. She had finally reached out for help, even if she wasn't sure anyone would notice or care enough to respond. All she could do now was wait and hope that someone would see her silent cry for help and have the compassion and courage to act on it.